I am Ula Brenna's daughter, and this is Saga Saturday. I am joined today by Dam Kinehild and Herr Bersi, which is a little bit of a tongue twister, by the way. I'm not sure that I excited about that. And today we are going through Lilja and Dream of the Rood. Excuse me. And I will let you guys each do introductions. So, Kinehild, why don't you start?
So I am Dam Kinehild. My focus in sort of, I guess, life and everything is Old English and sort of historic Germanic languages. Those are my jam. So today I'm going to be reading a poem, a segment of a poem, very short segment of a poem in Old English, because I would rather leave Old Norse to the Old Norse expert.
And I'm Bersi Edvardason. I nearly have a degree in Scandinavian studies with focus in Old Norse. So I'm going to be talking about the Old Norse Draupa Lilja, which is a mid 14th century poem.
Great. Fantastic. I think we have shared it out to everybody that might even possibly be interested in this. So we are going to start, Bersi, with you on a little bit of a biographical sketch of Lilja and then the readings.
All right. So as I said, this is a poem that we think was probably written in the mid 1300s. We note this for various reasons. One of the big problems in studying Old Norse poetry and literature in general is putting any sort of accurate date on the text. Oftentimes we are looking at manuscripts that are clearly not the original, not the oldest manuscript that ever was written. So we're pretty sure that the author's name was Eystein, and this could have referred to a certain brother Eystein Asgrimsson, who was an Episcopal visitor to Iceland in the 1350s. This is supported by the fact that the language is indicative. There's certain linguistic changes that were definitely had completed happening by the 1300s. For instance, rhymes like the word egi, which means not, rhyming with megias, which is spelled with a different vowel. So those vowels rhyming shows us its age. There's also a contemporaneous poem that borrows a lot from it, Arngrimur Brandsson's Gudmundur Draupa, which is a draupa about Bishop Gudmundur. And we know a more certain date on that one, so we can also place it sometime around 1345. So that's the dating on it. The meter is also indicative of this because it's a Hrynhent poem. Those who are more familiar with Old Norse poetry might know the term Drottbeit, which was a very popular poetic form where you have 6 syllables per line, 8 lines per stanza, some very complex metrical and rhyming and alliteration rules for within the line. Hrynhent is very much like that, except it has 8 syllables per line, which means there's a lot more space for the poet to express his ideas without having to mess up word order, which is part of why this poem has way fewer kennings, which we'll talk about later, and a more natural syntax. It sounds a lot more like prose. This is also the turning point, a sort of turning point in poetry at the time, where most of the poems written before this period were Drakfight, and most of the poems written after this period are Finnhend. So that helps us to date it as well. Would you like to know some more specifics about the subject, or should I just launch right into it?
Why don't you give us just a little bit, since we are going to read, we're going to start with stanza, 49, I think it is. We're kind of starting in the middle. So if you could give us a little bit of getting us up to speed as to where we're at now, and then we can jump into the stanza.
The poem, it's Lilja, which means lily, and it's referring to the imagery of Virgin Mary and her association with white lilies. But broadly, this poem is about salvation, the salvation of like the whole earth, as well as personal salvation for the poet himself. And it's broken up into 3 sections, much like a triptych, like a painting that's got 3 parts.
Yep.
And so, as Martin Chase says in his introduction on the poem, this divides history into 3 parts: from creation to incarnation, the life of Christ on earth, and the new age instituted by Christ's victory over sin and death. In this view, too, Christ is at the center, and the 2 wings of the triptych mirror one another in typological relationship. So at this point in the poem, we're right smack dab in the middle. So we've gotten to the Passion of Christ. And after this point, we're gonna like have a meditation on the Passion of Christ, Mary's suffering, his harrowing in hell, resurrection, ascension, Pentecost, all that. And then at the end of the poem, he talks about his own personal salvation, his need for that.
Great.
So, shall I read the Old Norse?
Please do, because I'm certainly not going to.
All right. So, listen for alliteration between lines. I'll try to emphasize it. Fusir flupu og fundun Jesum, fundin hryktu lumdu og bundu, bundin leiðu, hæðnir hæðu, hæðan reigvan slögdu klæðan, fjandans búrin frangum þyrni, þessir spenna blessað engu, þessir neglu Krista á krossinn, keyra Jan svo að stök dreyrinn.
Well, that's a mouthful.
Yeah. Those long lines, those extra syllables really...
They really are long. Even in the English, they are still long. So for those of you that don't speak Old Norse, here it is in the English. Frenzied men ran and found Jesus. Having found him, they abused him, struck him, and bound him. When he had been bound, they led him. Those fond of mocking mocked him. When he had been mocked, reviled, and clothed, the offspring of the fiend struck him. They wind a tight crown of thorn around the blessed forehead. They nailed Christ to the cross. They drive iron so that the blood spurted around. So yeah, that's pretty, it gets a little graphic there.
Yeah. Interesting about it is there seems to be one kenning in this entire verse, whereas in earlier poetry, especially Drakfight, you would find kennings everywhere. It'd be full of them, but there's just one kenning, the offspring of the fiend, meaning the angry mob. So there's this language is very straightforward. It just tells you exactly what happened.
Yeah. It is an interesting change from the earlier poetry. All right, now we're gonna go to Dream of the Rood.
So this is an earlier poem where Bersi is talking about a 13th century poem. Am I getting that right? 13th century? Okay.
14th century.
14th century, 13.
I always I am really, this is one of those embarrassing admissions that I need to make as a medievalist, is I am really bad when somebody gives me a date, they're like 1350, and I'm like, oh cool, 13th century. No, 14th century,
Nope.
Claire.
Nope.
So where he's talking about 14th century, I'm talking about a 10th century poem, possibly. So there is a really cool, it's probably earlier than 10th century. So it survives in the Vercelli book, which I'm very proud of myself there that I didn't say Vermicelli book, because that's what I've been calling it in my head all week. So the Vercelli book, which dates to about the 10th century, but there's an earlier inscription of it. There's a monumental cross called the Ruthwell Cross that we can date to the 8th century based on artwork and other hallmarks. That does contain a fragment of the poem inscribed upon it in runes in Futhorc. So that's kind of a neat example. So the poem existed at least in a fragmentary basis earlier, and then by the 10th century it had reached probably its complete form. So the author of it, we really don't know who the author is. Some scholars argue that it's a man named Cunewulf, who's one of like 9 Anglo-Saxon authors that we can actually name. But that's based largely on the fact that in the Vercelli book, a number of the other poems are attributed and signed by Cunewulf. So they're like, well, it goes in this book. It's got some similarities in terms of dialect and language, so it's possibly Cunewulf. Another theory that I've heard put forward is Caedmon. Caedmon is recorded as one of the first poets of the English language, or poets of a religious nature in the English language. But again, that's based largely on the fact that people have heard of Caedmon, and they're like, no, like he was a poet, this is by him. And that seems to be the argument there. So there's also some theories about multiple authors, but that's just, at this point, you're sticking spaghetti on a wall and trying to decide if it's done.
Right.
The poem is sometimes described as a riddle. It's described as eschatological or evangelical in nature. It really kind of defies a lot of these, and a lot of attempts to box it into one particular genre. The cross, one of the things I love about this poem is the cross itself expresses itself, and it's represented here. There's a really good author, Adelheid Thema, says the cross is portrayed as the Lord's retainer, as Christ's retainer, whose most outstanding characteristic is that of unwavering loyalty. So it commits a sort of treason by killing or wounding Christ. The poem never actually expressly says that he dies. He just rests and then he's buried. So, you know, but so he wounds or kills Christ, but then also redeems itself, because it leads others to greater salvation later. So that's in the part of the poem I'm going to read is just the sort of the moment of the crucifixion. At this point, the poet has kind of meditated on his place in the world, and then has this dream vision, and dream visions are kind of interesting in Anglo-Saxon culture, and if we have time I'll get into that. But he kind of meditates on this dream vision he has of the crucifixion from the cross's point of view, and in this dream the cross remembers back to when it was a beautiful tree, and then remembers being torn down by evil men and being made into this thing and set up on the hill at Golgotha and all that kind of stuff. So it's this very layers within layers kind of thing. So the point that I'm reading is just the point where it's the time to do the deed. So without much further ado, this is 39 through 49, if I remember correctly. Lines 39 through 49. On yerda hina tha young haleth, that was gorol michti. Strang and stith mod ye stach he on gelgen hena. Morian managra ye suchtha, thou he wold man kun lusan. Before ich da me se beoren umklipte, ne dorste ich hwathra, bogen to oerthen. Felan and foldan shiatum, ac ich schulde fasta standen. Rod was ich ararid. A hof ich richne kuning. Helven a hlaford holden me ne dorsta. Terugdriven he me mit derken nylum, on me sinden da dol siena. Opene in huid chlemes, ne dorste ich hire neigum schithan, besmurdan he unk butu at garera. Eal ich was me blood bestemmed, begotten of das gumen sidan, sithan he havde his gast onsended.
Yeah. What she said. And I get the easy part again. He stripped himself then, young hero, that was God Almighty. Strong and resolute, he ascended on the high gallows, brave in the sight of many, when he wanted to ransom mankind. I trembled when the warrior embraced me, even though I did dare bow to the earth. Fall to the corners of the earth, but I stand fast. I was reared across, I raised up the powerful king. The Lord of heaven, I did not dare bend. They pierced me with dark nails, on me are the wounds visible. The open wounds of malice, I did not dare to injure any of them. They mocked us both together, I was drenched with blood, poured out from that man's side after he had sent forth his spirit. So again, getting a little graphic. I mean, I guess you can't talk about the crucifixion without the graphic parts of it, but it's something that makes my little mean heart go pitter-pat. I love it. And I think that our viewers just learned way more about me than they probably needed to know.
But it's an interesting, I think one of the reasons that in preparing for this episode that we talked to Bersi about was that it's interesting how there's these similarities, the blood spilling, the focus on the nails driving through.
The iron nails, yeah.
Right. And it was interesting to me to see those two similarities, even though these poems are separated by quite a lot of time. But they come from two cultures that have historically shared some very close bonds, and really kind of interestingly how they cast Christ in a kind of heroic light. He's embracing his death. He accepts it, knowing that this is the step that he needs to take to save his band.
Right.
The key to being a Norse hero isn't just, performing great feats, but it is knowing of your fate, often tragic, and rising to meet it regardless.
Yeah.
And I think he's cast in that light.
I agree. And what I find interesting, I mean, of course, the dates are kind of assumed here, but they're 300 years apart, and they're both talking. I mean, the conversion to Christianity is ongoing. We haven't gotten there yet. We're getting closer by Lilja, but we're not there yet. And it fascinates me as to how long it took for conversion to Christianity, and how the poetry of the time, which you can assume speaks to the culture, it's by inches. It's little bit by little bit the conversion, and just how deeply rooted the heroic sagas are, and how they, to get to the conversion, you have to create Christ as a heroic figure, which
it's all. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, I was going to say which is the case. I mean, that's really the way it is in pretty much everything. But because the Norse and early English had, Old English had such strong heroic figures already, it just took extra pushing, right?
Yeah, it's the syncretization, I think is the word that I'm looking for, right? And we talk about it anytime you're talking about the conversion of a group to a new religion. You have examples of syncretized indigenous beliefs that sort of morph into. So you could talk about Saint Bridget appearing in Irish Christianity, and you're like, oh, there was a previously extant goddess Bridget who was the goddess of wells, and now we have Saint Bridget's wells all over Ireland,
right?
Amazing, right?
It's crazy how that works.
So but it is interesting to me, and there's another poem that we kind of talked about that we're not going to read from because none of us have Old Saxon, I think, in our inventory. Is Highland, and Highland really, really highlights this kind of attitude, because in it, not only is Christ cast as a sort of a war hero, a warrior hero in this traditional Germanic sense, but his whole world. He goes out, he seeks out his Yasith, he finds his warrior companions to follow him, and
his
this whole
warrior companions.
Yeah, so I know there was a couple of other stanzas that we talked about, Bersi, in that poem that kind of highlight some of the differences between Old English and Old Norse poetry, where Old English has some very strict rules, but they're much looser than Old Norse. But you've got a couple of Old Norse examples that really highlight the strict nature of Old Norse poetry.
And it also is an interesting commentary by the author himself on sort of the changes in poetry that are happening at this time period. Because as I said, this is sort of a turning point in poetry for the Scandinavian world, where we're starting to get into lyrical poetry from the continent. So a lot of the old, he actually speaks to specifically about Snorri's Eddas, which I know you've talked about in the past, the poetry manual and also collection of poetry that the manual is referencing that Snorri compiled, Snorri Sturluson, and which was compiled, you know, about 100 years before this poem was written. So it's got all this information primarily about kennings and how kennings work and how you're supposed to use them, and of course the myths that gave rise to specific kennings, just part of why we know any myths at all. But Brother Eystein has a different idea about how poetry should be written than Snorri does, and he talks about it in his own poem, and notably names his poem within this text, which usually for poems this old, we've put modern names on it, but we know this poem is called Lilja because he says in it, we should call this poem Lilja. I'm going to be reading two stanzas. The first stanza talks about the Eddas, and then the next stanza also talks about how he's going to be writing it and how he's going to be using fewer kennings and things like that. And you should listen for the end rhymes. You won't be able to miss it. These are unnecessary for the poetic form. He's just doing this to show off. And it's great. It's one of my favorite verses of poetry just because it's so over the top with virtuosity.
Yes.
So I'll read both stanzas at once.
Yeah, go ahead and read both at once, and then I'll do them in the English.
All right. Veri kotar nu virdas feitir, vati thes I kvaidis haiti, varkuni ad verka thena, vanda ag niner, eg thaiti standa, vardur mest ad aura orda, understavan si reiklig funden, eigi grug, thor ad edu regla, undan hljóti ad vikja stundum. I need to scroll down a little bit.
Right.
Svo Odin skal vandan velja, velurs for morg I kvæði ad selja, hulin for njörðin traut må telja, tel eg þennas for skilning velja, vel því að hér må skir orð skilja, skilji þjóðir með ljósan vilja, tal og breytilegt veit ad vilja, vil eg ad kvæðið heiti Lilja.
Hosts of men, be glad now. I expect this, that they will excuse, that I execute this poem less well in poetic form than it would seem to merit. It is of great importance that the right meaning of all words be found, even though the obscuring rule of the Edda must at times give way. He who must execute the elaborate poem chooses to put in the verse so many obscure archaisms, one can hardly count them. I say that he thus impedes understanding, because one here can understand clear words well. Let people understand my transparent intent, this ordinary speech given freely. I desire that the poem be called Lilja. So yeah, he's basically saying, I'm gonna do my thing and, you know, change the way we're doing poetry.
He decided that all these kennings are too confusing, and writing the poem as if it were a riddle it impedes understanding, and that the primary function of a poem is to be understood, which is very different from how many Drottningholm seem to be acting. For instance, in Gisla Saga, there's a man, Gisli is exiled eventually, but for murder. And there's actually multiple points where someone who he has murdered is getting a funeral, and he performs a verse at the funeral that essentially confesses the murder. But it takes his sister 3 weeks to figure out what he meant by the poem because it was so elaborate,
right,
and the meanings were all veiled. But when you read a translation in English, you're like,
it's right there.
Did he just say that he killed him? He just told a whole crowd of people that he just killed that guy.
So that's one of the things I love and I hate Hollanders' translation of the Poetic Edda. For this very reason, Hollander really takes the time to maintain the obscurity of language.
Mm-hmm.
And so you go through and you're reading what in other translations are made plain. And in his translation, you're like, I don't actually know what that's, you go back, you're like highlighting,
right,
and like, okay, find the verb, hunt, where in this sentence, where, there it is, found it.
That's why I would recommend Carol Larrington's translation, since she tends to preserve a lot of the kenning forms, and then we'll put a footnote or a side note, a margin note on the
translator's
side.
note.
Yeah, that translates the kennings, and then once she's given you one form of that kenning, she allows you to understand it for the rest of the time. Once you get one warrior metaphor, you're gonna know that metaphor the whole time.
Right.
So this is actually a good moment to kind of transition into very briefly talking about kennings, which we promised last time that we would. So there's a really important note here. Old Norse kennings and Old English kennings are very different in structure. Old English kennings are almost exclusively 2 words long. Mm-hmm. And so a couple of examples from Dream of the Rood, you have Eaxel Yaspana, which is the shoulder span, which is the cross, or Reorberend, which is a voice bearer, so the speaker. But they tend to be not very obscuring. They tend to be, a lot of them mean warrior, like if you're not sure what the answer is, you're like, no, maybe that could be warrior. There could be a warrior. It's, like that's 9 times out of 10, that's the answer. But they tend to be very, very short. While Old Norse kennings tend to be multiple lines, and because they're working within this structure, incredibly obtuse.
Yeah.
Very complex and hard to, very, very obtuse and complex.
The primary form of an Old Norse kenning still is a 2-word minimum, a base word that is replacing whatever noun that you're trying to talk about, and a determinant, something that's modifying that noun and makes it into an actual kenning. I forgot to grab actual examples, so I'm quickly in Old Norse examples. So I'm running through my things here. All right, here's one from a poem I translated last semester. Valnavers, which Val is Valn is to slay, and others means snakes. So these are slay snakes.
Swords?
Which would be, swords.
Swords.
So you can have very simple ones, but then there's also this conception of Reckitt. Reckitt means engraved in Old Norse, and we're not exactly sure why they used this term for this kind of kenning, but a Reckitt kenning means a kenning that has like multiple chains. It's not just Valnavers, but it's the something of something of something of something that all combined comes together to mean just one word. Just
right.
So like the Tungla Rurundum Tungla from last year.
Right. Here, what was it?
Last year, last episode.
Last weekend,
Last year.
last Saturday.
Feels like it. Yeah, that was Tungla Tungla, which is the destroyer of the moons of the bowsprit planks.
Right.
So the bowsprit planks, or rather, the destroyer is the base word here, and then the moons of all that were all determinants that all eventually come back to saying, well, what's the destroyer of a moon of about? Well, what's a moon of a bowsprit plank? Well, that's a shield, because you put a big round thing on a bowsprit, and that's a shield. Oh, a destroyer of a shield, that's a warrior.
Right.
And
right.
That's how you get to it.
You have to kind of back into it.
Exactly.
So we, as promised last week, we have each written a kenning in our languages, because I'm not even going to attempt Old Norse or Old English. So we are going to go right into kennings. I'll do mine first, since I'm already talking. And my goal was to do a kenning on something that is recent, relevant, right? So this is and I do not write at all, by the way. This is the first kenning I have ever written. So I blame both of you. I raise a toast to the sea steed racer, to the 9-fingered ale prow wielder, taken to the storm shrine, to Devo of 9 fingers. So that is relevant because he passed away Thursday night. And I actually met him not in the SCA or through Ren Fair. I met him sailing. So that is what I associated, him with, being on the deck of a sailing boat. So that's the sea steed racer. He actually used to race yachts, the little like, I don't know, 30 footers or whatever. Yeah.
Wow.
Obviously 9-fingered. He was missing one of his index fingers. That's pretty clear. Ale prow wielder.
Ale prow.
A brewer?
Like a horn, like a
drinking horn.
Drinking horn, yeah.
Ale prow, because it's when it's curved, it's it's an ale prow.
Yeah.
So, and taken to the storm shrine is taken to the grave, right? And again, because he was a sailor, I was keeping with kind of sailing metaphors. So that is my first and so far only attempt at a kenning.
Oh, great.
That was magnificent.
Yeah.
I might try more.
That's at a kenning.
So Bersi, do you want to go next, or do you want me to?
Sure. I did not translate this to Old Norse. I also chose a modern thing, and I it's just one kenning. So if I think I've already told Kinehild what it is, but Ula, if you'd like to guess,
all right,
what this will mean, just one thing. The impassable storm of ships of the river of black ice.
Traffic jam.
Absolutely.
Love it. That is actually really quite brilliant. I love that.
So mine is also a modern thing, and I did kind of put it into Old English, and keeping with the tradition of very simple kennings in Old English. The other, I guess I should have warned everybody, the other thing about Old English kennings is they can be, if they're not warrior, they can be very obtuse. So, or they can have a lot of right answers. So mine is Beorcht book, or bright book, or light book. So
your computer
or smartphone was the other one, because I read all my books now on my smartphone.
Right.
So yes.
Yeah.
I love it. No, that's great. Kennings are a ridiculous fascination for me, because I love riddles, right? And they're really just big riddles.
Exactly.
And you'd have, in Old English, you have the Exeter book riddles. So we know that there was, at least to some extent, a tradition of this cunning game, right? And cunningness is a quality that is admired both among the English and among the Norse. And I was always sort of confused about why you didn't have similar riddles preserved. There's like 2 sagas, I think, have riddles mentioned, preserved riddles. And so I kept wondering, like, why is there not, obviously there's not the writing tradition in Old Norse that there was in Old English at the same time. But I think, and somebody in a chat once was like, oh, well, it's kennings. And in my head, I was still stuck on Old English kennings. And I'm like, I mean, that's 2 words. Like you stand around, everybody just like Swan Road. Oh, it's the ocean. Oh, you know, but now that I've learned more about what constitutes an Old Norse kenning, like I can see where that's filling that space,
right? Yeah.
And becoming its own riddle. Because when you talk about the, you know, the jam on the ice road, or as yours was much better than my attempt to remember it on the fly. You know, it really does become, and you think about if they're, you know, they're doing the translated word is all I can come up with, the man evening, where they're all sitting around and insulting each other, but they're throwing down these drotkvit, which are very obtuse and very riddle-like, just to pick apart and understand what the stanza says.
And often, especially when someone very skilled is using them, the ambiguities in the words that they choose, and not just to, like, for instance, what you did, Ula, with keeping with the ship and the storm, that's exactly what they would have done, is try to keep going with the same kinds of metaphors, alluding to the same things. Like, for instance, there's a verse from the Jarl's Saga talking about when Jarl was burned inside his house, and they refer to the fire multiple times as, in terms as a wolf, of the wolf of the forest, so the enemy of a forest, right? With fire, right? And then as a dog, and then the verbs that they use to say that the fire is burning things is all consumption and eating and biting.
Right.
Keeping along the same lines. And not only will they do that, but sometimes ambiguities will have double meanings when you refer to the for instance, you could be referring to jewelry on a woman's arm or a hawk perched on her arm, and that would give you an idea of being a warrior. I've seen this used, I can't remember exactly how it was phrased, but to refer to not just a woman, but a woman who was also a Valkyrie. So the double meanings in the ambiguity can actually both be true at the same time, and give you more context for the metaphor.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And some of them are, I love alliterations. So I try to stick all of that together too. And that was kind of the C, I can't even say it because they're all tongue twisters. C steed racer.
Yes.
Yeah, that was where I was headed there. So I think we're probably about ready to wrap this up. We've blathered on for a good 40 minutes on things that entertain us. So next week, we are going to talk about the tale of Thorstein Shiver. And I actually haven't, I read that about 1.5 million years ago. So I'll be brushing up on that. And I think we should do another original kenning challenge.
Sure. Yeah.
Right?
I'm gonna have to like bring a better game because Ula, I think you won this one.
Ula blew us out of the water today.
It's amazing what sitting on my deck with a bottle of wine will do it, you know. So yeah, join us next week, same time, 11:30. The tale of Thorstein Shiver. This recording will go up onto YouTube, where I'm going to make a Saga Saturday YouTube feed. So if anyone is interested in revisiting it or didn't catch it the first time around, and Facebook is hard to kind of navigate back to old things a lot. So I will be posting a link there. And I want to thank you both for, again, playing along with this ridiculous thought that I had. And I am learning a lot. and be completely enjoying nerding out with you guys on this. This just makes my little geeky heart happy.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Bersi, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, you're saving my butt, because this way I don't have to pretend like I know much about Old Norse. I can just be like, and our Old Norse expert.
Right?
So.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure getting to talk about this. My friends are their ears are getting a little worn out.
I know how you feel.
Yeah, no, I think we're probably all in the same boat on that one. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much, and we'll talk later.
All right.